Hello everyone, welcome to this informational webinar. My name is Dr. Yajaira Sierra Sastre, Chair of Project PoSSUM's PoSSUM 13 initiative. Created to honor the legacy of the Mercury 13, the PoSSUM 13 is a talented group of 13 female scientist astronaut candidates from Project PoSSUM, who serve as global ambassadors for STEM and space. The PoSSUM 13 are on a mission to increase opportunity for students, particularly young women, who are interested in space science and exploration. This informational webinar will focus on the following objectives. We will provide an overview of PoSSUM 13's International Microgravity Flight Challenge. We will also review the eligibility criteria for this year's flight campaign. And lastly, we will provide an introduction of microgravity research and the Falcon 20 aircraft. This is the timeline of the 2020 International Microgravity Flight Challenge. Student proposals for microgravity research are due on May 1st. On May 15, 2 winning teams will be announced. And during the months of June and July, these students will be receiving mentoring from the PoSSUM 13 ambassadors in areas of payload fabrication, experimental design, and pre-flight, in-flight, and post-flight procedures. One student from the top winning team will have the opportunity to fly as a mission specialist on board the Falcon 20 in the months of September or October, tentatively, as part of PoSSUM's annual microgravity campaign. Last year's winner, Ivana Hernandez from Colombia, is seen here running her experiment and floating inside the cabin of the Falcon 20 aircraft. All students between 13 and 17 years of age are invited to participate. This includes students enrolled in charter schools, but also students from non-traditional institutions such as homeschools, robotic clubs, or community-led organizations. Teams of up to 4 students may apply, so long as the team leader is a female or female-identifying student. Teams require at least one adult mentor, and your mentor can be a parent, a teacher, community leader, or a scientist. Your experiment will be evaluated by a team of experts assessing the following categories: feasibility of the proposed approach, the innovation and creativity of your idea, relevance of having your experiment in a reduced gravity environment, safety compliance, and teamwork, leadership, and communication skills.
Hello everybody, this is Heidi Hammerstein. I wanted to share with you a little bit about our microgravity campaign in Canada last year in 2019. Here is a picture of the PoSSUM 13 women in the campaign for 2019, and we had a very good contingent of ladies, and very, very proud to show off our Falcon 20 behind us. And here's Ivana again, right front and center in this photo. And here we are inside the Falcon 20. This is me, this in the suit. This time I'm in the spacesuit. This is one of our flights last year. I'm with my colleague, Richard Blakeman, and he served as the test director in this particular flight. You can see him holding on to his flight plan there with the test points while he's taking a selfie of us floating in microgravity. So we are having quite a good time. Despite all the very important scientific work we're doing, we always have a lot of fun. So there you go. That is a little taste of our operations at the CNRC, and I hope you can design an experiment and come fly with us in 2020. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Hello, my STEM enthusiasts. My name is Dr. Gonzalez Riccio. I'm one of the PoSSUM 13 scientist astronaut candidates, and I'm here to guide you through the application process for the Microgravity Challenge. We are currently on the Project PoSSUM 13 website, And let's scroll down for the guidelines. As you see here, here are the payload guidelines. Click that prompt and you will see the constraints for your experiment and the guidelines. Just remember, when you are designing your experiment, you're going to have restricted time to collect data. You'll be undergoing 6 parabolic flights, and which will consist of 20 seconds of microgravity. So when you're designing your experiment, keep in mind you only have 20-second increments to collect data in microgravity. You can actually have an experiment with a human interface. So if you want to test tools, the astronauts can actually use your tool and see the ease of it while wearing their spacesuit glove. You can actually design electronics that the astronaut can wear if you want to measure heart rate, perspiration, blood pressure, or electrical stimulus. If you want to test astronauts in their ability to do particular tasks or decision making, you can design experiments. For example, if there is loud noise or different light exposures, you can actually have the astronaut either, let's say, solve a Rubik's Cube or answer questions, simple algebraic question, let's say, and do they do better or worse, or is there no change if they're exposed to some type of stress? If you are designing a typical experimental payload that is testing any type of biology, physics, material science, you do have size and weight constrictions. The size restrictions, similar to a CubeSat or a lunchbox, the dimensions are 20 by 10 by 10 centimeters. The weight cannot exceed 11 pounds or 5 kilograms. Okay. If you are using some type of battery, try not to. All right. We want to avoid any type of chemical-based batteries like electrolytes or lithium-based batteries. If you could use dry cell, please do. Again, any chemicals that are classified as detriments, physical health, or environmental hazards, avoid it. Again, when you design the experimental payloads, again, we will be guiding you through this process. It will be tested in the ground under 9Gs to make sure it doesn't break. If you are using biological specimens, OSHA guidelines do apply. No harm to the animal will be happening, and they should be sealed so they won't escape. Let's look back, how to write the proposal. The proposal guidelines is similar to writing a lab report. Again, no more than 5 pages long, Times New Roman, double-spaced, 12-point font. And you can include and encourage figures and drawings that will help enhance your description of your experiment. Your cover page will be entitled with the project, all the students involved and their ages, the adult mentor, each role of your team members, mission patch, and the name of your school. Please include an abstract, which is a short summary of your proposal. List the equipment and how it's going to be used. That's page 2. And you also have your project description. What is the background to your experiment? Why is it important to be tested in micro G? And then you lead into your thesis statement, stating why 20 seconds is enough to collect data for your experiment. After you finish writing, please include a video, no more than 2 minutes, in your native language, indicating what is your experiment, introduce your team members, and why this opportunity excites you. We PoSSUM 13 are so excited to read all your entries, and good luck.
Hello everyone, my name is Prasad, and I'll be talking a bit more about parabolic flight campaigns. The flight campaigns take place from Ottawa, Canada. So on the image on the left, I've shown the country Canada on a world map, and on the right, the different provinces and cities and territories of Canada. And you can probably make out Ottawa, the city at the bottom right corner of the image, and this is where we'll be flying from. If we zoom in to the Ottawa area, at the center is downtown Ottawa. This is where our parliament and government buildings are located, Ottawa being the capital of Canada. There's also a very nice tourist byward market area and the Canadian Air and Space Museum. To the north is Gatineau Park, which is a national reserve, a very beautiful park to visit. And to the south is the National Research Council of Canada Flight Research Lab, which is where the flight campaigns will be taking place. I have some photos here. On the top left is Gatineau Park. You can see the tree colors in the fall. If you're selected and able to come to the flight campaign, it'll be a very, very pretty sight because it'll take place in the fall. At the top right, we have Parliament Building, and at the bottom, we have some photos of airplanes inside the Canadian Air and Space Museum. If you like airplanes and spacecraft, this is definitely a place to visit. So I want to talk a bit more about what is microgravity. I know that the slide looks busy and there's a lot of information, but I just want to highlight a few key points here. So our understanding of gravity depends on the context. We can talk about gravity as a force, an acceleration, or even a constant. And there are three scientists that played a role in developing our understanding of gravity. These are Galileo, Isaac Newton, and Henry Cavendish. Galileo measured the size of the Earth and the radius of the Earth, or played a role in us measuring those properties. Isaac Newton gave us the laws of motion equations. For example, F force equals ma, the mass and the acceleration that's acting on the mass. And Cavendish measured the gravitational constant, which is a property that all objects have, and it measures their ability to attract each other. So if you take the size of the Earth, the mass of the Earth, the gravitational constant, and F equals ma, you can actually calculate what is the acceleration due to Earth's gravity, and that value comes out to be 9.81 meters per second squared. And this basically describes how quickly objects that are thrown in the air will come back to the ground. And it also helps describes the arc of, let's say you throw a ball to your friend. That ball will not travel in a straight line, but it'll travel in an arc, a parabola actually. And so these equations help us to understand that movement, that trajectory. And the images that you see of Earth and the different colors, these basically show that the gravity on this, at least on the surface of the Earth, varies depending on where you are. Things like mountains, densities, volcanic activities, and so on, all affect this value of 9.81. So in some places it's higher, some places it's lower. And on the graph to the left, what it shows is how the acceleration due to Earth's gravity changes depending on where you are relative to the center of the Earth. So if you're exactly at the center of the Earth, then there's no gravity there. And as you move toward the surface of the Earth, the gravity gets stronger. And then as you move away from the surface of the Earth, the gravity gets weaker. So that's what that plot shows. And so you've probably seen images of astronauts floating inside the space station. So here we have Julie Payette, a Canadian astronaut, floating inside the International Space Station. And you might be tempted to think that she's floating because there's no gravity there. There's no gravity to pull her down, so she's floating. But if we think about that a bit more, at the bottom I have images of the moon orbiting the Earth, and also the Earth orbits the sun. So it's gravity that keeps the moon in orbit around the Earth. It's gravity that keeps the Earth in orbit around the sun. So it's not fair to say that there's no gravity in space. And in fact, if you look at the International Space Station, it itself is orbiting the Earth. and we know where it is. It's about 400 kilometers above the surface of the Earth. So if you calculate what is the gravitational field that it feels, I did that calculation shown here, and it comes out to be about 90% of Earth's gravity. So it's definitely not zero. It's closer to about a value of 9. So the reason why Julie Payette is floating in space is not because the acceleration due to Earth's gravity is zero. Rugby player that is falling. That is what microgravity is. It's free falling. And so there are lots of sciences that study things in microgravity, or also called reduced gravity, things that we study things that are alive, or we study things that are not alive. Things that are alive are like little insects and bacteria and water bears, even plants and people, psychology, brain activity, and so on. And things that are not alive are things like flames or crystals or fluids. Fluids can behave very differently in free fall than they do on the ground. So here's an experiment that we can try out. I have a photo here of Chris Hadfield. He's a retired Canadian astronaut, and he's wearing his extravehicular spacesuit. And Chris Hadfield looks pretty normal here. His eyes are open, he's smiling a little bit there, he's got his mustache. Everything looks normal. And if I take this photo and flip it upside down, it may not be too apparent, but it looks like Chris Hadfield again, nothing too unusual, and he looks fine. But if I were to flip that upside down photo, I don't know if you see that, something looked kind of strange there. I don't know if you caught it, especially around his eyes. So let me flip it again. And you can see that something is definitely not right with Chris Hadfield. And it's more apparent now that the image is flipped, right? His eyes look upside down, his eyebrows are below his eyes, and he's not smiling. His mouth is actually rotated upside down. So it's interesting that when it's upside down, he looks normal, but when we flip that image over, it definitely doesn't look normal. And this indicates our psychology. We're so used to seeing people standing upright with their facial features, eyebrows above the eye, eyes above the nose above the mouth, that we don't really notice these subtle changes that can happen. And one experiment would be, if you were to take this doctored photo of Chris Hadfield and look at it in near free fall, would it be immediately apparent that something is wrong, or would you still have to flip the photo upside down, right side up to notice the differences? Here I have just a brief slide of some of the questions that are answered by space sciences. We study things in near free fall because we want to understand where our Earth and solar system came from, where we are in the universe, where we're going, and where life came from, and are we alone? These are some of the big questions, the reason why we do science. And the Greeks had a word for this called the logos. If you think of biology, biologos, the reason why living things are the way they are. So I just thought that was an interesting point to think about why we do science. There are different ways to get free fall. I mentioned the space station. Here I have a list of other platforms, and in particular I'm going to focus on parabolic aircraft. So parabolic aircraft are shown here. On the left we have parabolic aircraft from Europe, and on the right we have the Canadian parabolic aircraft, the Falcon 20. And these aircrafts are typical aircrafts that you probably have taken to go on vacation somewhere. The only difference is that the interiors we've removed all the seats essentially, and we have a lot of room to put experiments inside. And you can see that when the aircraft shown here, these photos, the aircrafts are actually climbing upward. So if you look at this graph, the aircraft is climbing, and that's when these photos were taken. And then eventually the aircraft will stop climbing and will actually pitch the nose downward and fall. And when it falls, everything in the aircraft free floats inside, and so you see images here of people floating inside the aircraft. And that's how we create a free fall environment using an aircraft. Again, it's the same environment, the same idea as on the station. In this case, the space station is falling around the Earth, but the difference is that on the station you have more time and you can put more equipment and do longer studies. So for example, you can have people run and do exercise and so on. Um, so one thing that I do want to mention is that the PoSSUM 13 competition is taking place as part of a broader and larger parabolic flight campaign. And our main goal is to test spacesuits. So in particular, we have spacesuits that we developed that are have special gloves and so on. So when you think about experiments to propose, keep in mind that we have someone in a spacesuit, and maybe you can think of an experiment where being in free fall might affect their performance versus when they're on the ground. So, for example, is it easier or more difficult to operate a joystick if you're in free fall, or are they able to write easily or not easily in free fall versus on the ground? Maybe if they look at pictures of people that are right side up and upside down, can they tell if someone is smiling or not smiling, or if something is strange, just like we did with Chris Hadfield? So these are some of the experiments that you can propose for someone to do inside the aircraft. Now, the National Research Council of Canada is a very fantastic place to be to do research. I have photos here of the hangar, and you can see it's a large hangar. Lots of different aircrafts are there. And if you're selected, if you have a good experiment and you're selected, I think you'll have a great time coming to visit there. In these slides, I describe a bit of the history of our Falcon 20 aircraft and how it came to be. If you're interested, the program started in 1986, and it's been going on ever since. So there's a lot of history to this aircraft. This is what the aircraft looks like on the exterior. It looks like a really fancy business jet, and in fact, it was a business jet. So at the bottom left, you can see what the interior of the aircraft would have looked like. In the center, this is what the actual aircraft looks like. I mentioned again that we take away all the seats so that we have room to do experiments, but the aircraft can get crowded. So in the picture at the bottom right, I show what the aircraft can look like when we're practicing, putting experiments inside, and even when we're flying and doing experiments, we can have 6, 7 people in there. So it gets pretty crowded. So keep that in mind as you design your experiment. It's something that shouldn't require too much room, too many hand movements, something that's really can be operated by someone in a very tight environment. If you're interested about the aircraft, some more details, feel free to pause the slides, but I described here some of the changes that were made to the aircraft for it to work in a free fall environment. We have to do some changes to the hydraulics and to the oil system. Otherwise, the fluids behave kind of strange in near free fall. So these are some of the changes. This is what a typical parabola looks like. This is the language that's used when we talk about doing free fall experiments in an aircraft. We talk about a parabolic maneuver, and the parabola comes from the shape of this curve at the back here. So what happens is the aircraft will fly sort of level flight. We get the experiment ready, and when we're ready to go, the aircraft will climb up. If you think back to those pictures we showed earlier, the aircraft's at an angle, they're climbing. And then as we reach the apogee, this is about 10,000 feet that we'll climb. The aircraft will pitch the nose downward and fall, and we'll have about 20 seconds of near free fall to do your experiment. This is what the flight plan looks like from takeoff from the NRC airport. We do all these different parabolas, different shapes, and then come back. That's about an hour of flying. And I described it a bit more detail here. Again, feel free to pause and read this in more detail. We can do parabolas back to back, one after the other, known as continuous, or we can do it sequentially, one parabola at a time, go back into level flight, and then do another parabola. If your experiment requires, like, after each parabola to be reset, then we would have to do sequential. But if your experiment is able to go back to back to back, that's even better, because we can do the experiment more quickly. So keep that in mind as you're designing your experiment. For those of you who are interested, I have some data here on the G levels, or the acceleration levels of the aircraft, the altitude of the aircraft, and the airspeed. I also have some data on the longitudinal, latitudinal, and vertical accelerations of the aircraft. And I think you'll be most interested in the vertical accelerations, the up-down acceleration, that both the aircraft and yourself are going to be falling towards the ground. That's how we achieve free fall. So gravity is definitely not zero, but we get pretty close to free fall. This is the bird's eye view of the cabin of the aircraft. So at the front, we've got two pilots. And then at the back of the aircraft, there's a lot of space. We could put different seats. We have different arrangements depending on what experiments we're planning to fly. This is a cross-section of the cabin, and it gives you a sense of just how tall and wide the cabin is. And I also show here a drawing of the door, so you get a sense of, how big, how much space you have to move things in and out of the aircraft. So when you're thinking about what experiments to propose, there are some types of experiments that you can study in free fall, that you must study in free fall, and then there are other types of experiments that don't really matter. You don't really need free fall. So to be competitive, you want to propose an experiment that you can do in 20 seconds of free fall, and it's absolutely necessary to do this experiment on the aircraft. So I'll give you some examples that are shown here. So at the top right, I have cereal in a bowl of milk. And we all know from experience that cereal will float on the milk. And that's because the cereal is lighter, the milk is heavier, and so the light things will float to the top. But in free fall, it doesn't matter if something is light or heavy because there's no normal force acting on the system. So the question is, what would happen to the cereal in the milk? Would it still float to the top? Would it go to the bottom? What will it do? And a similar question can be asked about ice and water. So at the bottom, I have a photo of ice in a cup of water, and obviously the ice floats at the top. You probably experience that at home. And the reason is because the ice is lighter than the water. So what would happen if you did this experiment in free fall? Would the ice still float to the top? Would it sink to the bottom? Would the ice cubes sort of randomly distribute themselves in the water? These are questions that you can't really do on the ground because you need at least 20 seconds to set the experiment up. On the left, I show dye in water. So this is basically food coloring added to water, and the food coloring is heavier than water. That's why it sinks to the bottom. And this person is actually pouring the food dye into the water. But the question is, how would you do this experiment, or how would it be different in free fall? Like, you can't really pour something, can you, in free fall? How would you pour the dye into the water? And then once the dye is in the water, will it sink? Will it stay where it is? In this case, you can see the dye sort of looks like a cone. It's very narrow at the top and it spreads out at the bottom. Is that what happens in free fall? So these are some of the experiments you can think about. Notice again also a simple candle. If you light it on the ground, we all know what a candle looks like. It's yellow, it feels warm, it has this sort of pyramid shape. But if you light the same candle, this is just a birthday candle. If you light the same candle in free fall, notice how the flame looks very different. It looks darker, it's blue, it looks spherical, it's very strange. So these are some of the experiments that you can think about proposing for this competition. Examples of experiments that probably wouldn't work would be, does the color of the dye change? Well, color doesn't really matter on gravity, right? If you have a red ball, then whether it's free floating or just sitting on your desk, it'll still be red. So an experiment that looks at the color of the ball and how that changes in microgravity wouldn't really get accepted because it doesn't depend on gravity. Things like numbers of things. So let's say you have four erasers, and you want to know, will the number of erasers change if it's in free fall or not? Well, the number of erasers doesn't really depend on gravity. It just depends on how many erasers are there. So think about, when you propose your experiment, something that really is affected by gravity, and that's probably a good sign that it's an experiment that you might want to develop a bit more. So finally, I have a video here, hopefully it plays, of just what it's like inside the aircraft. We have a camera at the back that's recording all of the different people and equipment. And you can see we have someone in a spacesuit at the bottom right. And just take a look at the activity inside the cabin. Things are floating, things are being thrown around. You can notice that people are struggling a little bit to maintain control. Like when you throw a patch or a pit here, it doesn't quite behave the way that you expect. And so hand-eye coordination is sometimes challenging. So keep that in mind as you design your experiment. You'll also notice that there's lots of photos, logos, and banners. So as you propose your experiment, think about designing a nice logo for your team and your experiment. And then hopefully you have time to have some fun. If you get selected to fly, think about bringing something that you think is special that you want to free float and try it out. Okay, so there is everything I had to say. If you have any more questions, feel free to reach out to me and I'll pass it back to Haida. Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aaron, for the wonderful introduction to microgravity research. And thank you all for watching this webinar. If you have any more questions about the International Microgravity Flight Challenge, please email us at possum13@projectpossum.org and visit our website, projectpossum.org/thepossum13. We are also on social media, so please follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at ProjectPossum13. Thank you very much. We hope you submit your proposals and see you in Ottawa. Bye!